Okay. So we took a little bit of a break, and I thank you for that, especially for that first week, and so I could just kind of get out and away, and appreciate it very much. So it's been a couple of weeks since we've been able to sit and talk, but just to make sure we're all in the same chapter. This was chapter 9, right? Okay, I thought so. So the most trustworthy sense. So before we start, let me offer a brief prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we might come together again after a brief stop so that we might give thanks, and in doing so, be appreciative of all of the gifts that you offer to us on a daily and moment by moment basis. Help us, Lord, as we dig into this chapter, that we would find illumination, learning, knowledge, and your grace. That as we talk about this trustworthy sense of touch, that we might always find our trust and hope in you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Okay, so this was sort of an interesting title to me in the sense of several of the chapter titles are very straightforward. Again, but then some of them are a little more poetic or evocative, and this kind of falls into that category, I think. The most trustworthy sense. It doesn't even tell you what it is. You have to kind of start reading for a little bit before you figure it out. And to be honest, even his first story, once you know that what the trustworthy sense is, it makes sense, but you kind of have to get to the end of the story to figure out what he's talking about. So just to be straightforward, what is the most trustworthy sense of this chapter? Touch. And when you think about it, you know, we've especially we've talked about vision and sight, about just how much information we are taking in visually all the time, but what we rely on a constant basis, especially in ways we don't think about until we have to, is this feeling of touch. Now, all the more specific for somebody like Dr. Brand, who obviously spent a career dealing with the absence of touch through these leprosy patients and all of its consequences. But it won't just be leprosy that he talks about, and there's going to be several little elements about touch that, you know, just kind of remind us about how much we rely so fully and wholly on this physical sensation. So let's recap this first story real quick. It was kind of an odd story in comparison to a lot of the others. So who can kind of sum up this first story, especially if you haven't read it in a couple of weeks?
He was speaking at a leprosy conference.
Okay, speaking at a leprosy conference.
And came away from it having flu.
And he got sick with the flu.
Went back to his hotel to recuperate.
Went back to the hotel to recuperate.
And I forgot when, whether it was the next morning. Anyway, he felt like he had lost the feeling in his left foot.
Okay, lost the feeling in his left foot.
He gets a pin and
Pricks his foot with a pin. Nothing.
And finally, the next morning, he realizes.
Then one day.
Yeah, the next morning he realizes that it was because of the way he'd been sitting.
Yeah, right. So the next morning, it's the feeling is back.
He's numbed.
And he would sort of numbed his leg by the way he'd been sitting. And so, you know, he picked, it was kind of like this little scene, and he pricks that foot again the next day, and ouch! but never been so happy to be in pain. And why? Why was he so happy to be in pain?
Because he knew he didn't have leprosy.
Right. That was the sign of, you know, I think after all these years, I have contracted leprosy. And so can't help but have all of these things run through his head. You know, all of these people that I've told for years that it's safe to treat lepers. And if I get it, what is that going to do to them? I won't be able to operate anymore. I won't be able to, you know, practice medicine to help people anymore. I will start feeling all of the suffering and effects of this, and then think about all the people who now won't go help the lepers either. Because if it could happen to me, how many other doctors and nurses are going to opt out or never come? And so he's got like this whole future churning in his mind about how everything is now changed for the worse. And it all turns out that his foot was asleep. So a couple of things to that. First of all, I'm sure we've all, you know, had our foot or our arm or something fall asleep by, you know, the way we sat on it or whatever, and it always is a little disconcerting, especially if it lingers a little longer than you expect it to, and you start thinking you've actually done something wrong. And the same thing can happen with other senses as well. You know,
However, we wouldn't be as sensitive to that situation as the good doctor was.
Oh, I think you're right there. Yeah, that of all the people for this to happen to, for it to happen to him, how can he not immediately go to the worst case scenario?
Absolutely.
Very few of us would have a numb foot and think we've contracted leprosy, because there's no reason to think that. But obviously, not only was there reason he could have conceivably contracted it, being around lepers all the time, but being an expert in it, knowing exactly how it starts and how it would go from there. I mean, all the more reason that this would be so frightening and so worrisome. You know, you can't be out and about today and have the most innocent of without everybody staring you down, right? And
You're right.
Because,
Absolutely.
and that's not because your cough is any different than it would have been a year ago, but because of the circumstances, everyone is terrified that any kind of cough is COVID, and you're going to give it to me and I'm going to die. And it's just, you know, it's straight to from A to Z instantly with the worst case scenario. But it is something to consider. Somebody like Dr. Brand, who could really and almost instantaneously process what this would all mean. And it is pretty overwhelming. All that stuff that we talked about, you know, he wouldn't be able to care for patients anymore, but then other people would be discouraged from caring for patients. And now we're talking about not only I can't help them, but maybe no one will. Because if it can happen to him, well, then maybe all those, well, just everything that's happened over the past few decades with his work may all come to nothing. I had the difficult experience of spending time with a neurosurgeon who was diagnosed with a progressive dementia, who knew exactly what was going to happen and what the stakes were and how much he would lose and how quickly it would happen. And there was a very, very special poignancy to knowing.
Mhm.
There's some times maybe it's best not to know. Well, there was no way he couldn't not know. So that overwhelming sense of what all of this is going to mean. But it's sort of funny if you think about this, the way the chapter is structured, that this label of the most trustworthy sense actually starts off with a story of its untrustworthiness. He got a message from his touch, and the message was wrong. Not so much that it was that the touch was mistaken, I guess, so much as it was his interpretation of it.
He read it wrong.
But it was just amazing about how much would have been lost if his sense of touch had indeed been lost through leprosy. All right, so this next section that he moves into, and he gives it another, kind of evocative label, a world of touch. And, we've kind of dealt with this sort of sideways in mentioning his work with the leprosy patients and how damaged their bodies had become due to their lack of touch. And so we've gotten kind of a lot of the negative examples, stories about people who, because their eyes don't blink enough, they lose sight. Because they bump into small things, they damage their bodies. Because they don't turn over in bed, they develop sores. Because they can't feel that the stove is hot, they have burns, and so on and so forth. So if that's kind of the negative side of touch, or at least its loss, to make the transition for a world of touch, I think is kind of reminding us about all of the positive stuff that we don't tend to think about, but that we experience all the time because we can touch. So what are some of the things that he brings up that we probably don't give a second thought to at all, because we do have that capacity and ability to feel our surroundings and our circumstances?
I'm talking about the activities.
Yeah, just a few things, the kind of offhanded things.
He said sports, music, art,
Okay,
cooking.
sure. So we could take any of those to say sports. Could you participate in sports if you lack the ability to feel? If your body wasn't able to process the sensation, the physical sensations around you? I mean, I can't think of one where, not being able to touch wouldn't completely ruin whatever it is you were trying to do. Whether you're trying to hold a ball or grip a bat, or even if you're trying to just run or move in a coordinated fashion, how can you do that if you can't feel the ground underneath your own feet?
I never thought of that. Yeah.
Same thing with art. Whether you're painting or sculpting or drawing, if you have no fine motor control because you can't feel the pencil or the brush in your hand, it's kind of like presumably you could grip it, but anything that you do, you could only see after the paint's already smeared on the paper, whether it was too hard, too heavy, it was moving in the exact right direction or not. Hard to imagine playing any kind of music on any kind of instrument if you can't actually feel. But these are all things that we do just sort of, we don't think about, but without the ability to do it. Imagine trying to cook something.
Being a baker.
Yeah, having the sensitivity of a very small child. If you've ever baked with children, everything has, you almost have to use your hands with their hands because they grip eggs like this. and smash, or they drop them, and to get a child, especially a very young one, to do something like, we need to put a cup of flour in this bowl. So to scoop the cup and to smooth off the top, and then this whole motion seems to be difficult for some reason, because they just got to, there's flour everywhere. So that fine motor control that we think nothing of until it's not there. So I kind of liken that with him saying this world of touch, we're constantly swimming in it. We, like the fish that doesn't know that it's wet. We don't think that about living in a world of tactile sensation because we're swimming in it. And yet it's kind of our fundamental way of relating to the world.
That's true. Yeah.
From
one of the places where COVID has really hurt us, because like, especially at church, no more hugging and passing the peace, and, and even families that are separated and can't put their hands on each other. That's very, very difficult.
It's probably been the worst aspect of this, that there are lots of diseases or circumstances that can kill people. Car accidents, poisoning, cancer. But to have that combined with something that's preventing people from actually comforting each other in that loss or through it, is what I have found to be the worst part of this. A tragedy can happen at any time, but something that makes that tragedy sit there all by itself just feels so much worse, especially when it keeps happening. It's not for nothing that you're talking about this world of touch. That may be, if not what we perceive, then at least it's certainly what we offer at the very beginning of life and at the very end. When you have nothing else that to say, don't you just hold a hand or put a hand on a shoulder, touch a cheek? From a smallest baby where, they're crying, you can't argue them out of their crying, but you can hold them. And to be at someone's deathbed, to go into a hospital room, and maybe they can hear you, maybe they can't, maybe they can see you and maybe they can't. But one of the last gifts that you can offer is touch. And there's something about that touch that just feels so human.
Wasn't Dr. Brand the one that told the story about the babies that died because they were not being touched?
Right. That was in an Eastern European orphanage. And there was a woman, an older woman, and she would just hold the babies, and the ones that she held, they would live. And it was sort of like when they didn't know what to do medically, they would say, well, bring her in and let them hold her. And it would, these babies would,
Yeah, that was their last resort.
Yeah.
Their medical efforts weren't successful.
Yeah, and there's a clinical description of this lack of thriving, and that can come from the lack of physical touch. I think, again, in speaking about childbirth, and I've been around for a few, at least my own children, and the first thing that they do when the baby is born is right in the arms of the mother. Presumably if the baby is breathing and crying on their own, but right in the arms of the mother. And there's all these chemical interactions that are happening in both the baby and the mother because of that. And when it can't happen for some reason, how devastating it is for the family. You know, you talk to people who had babies in the NICU or in these, you know, the isolated incubators and stuff like that. And that's like the worst part of it for them. They're so small and they're so helpless, and I can't even touch them. There are some things that I don't know how we communicate any more effectively than some sort of physical contact. And it's the world we are born into and we die out of. It's the air we breathe. And again, this image of, you know, fish in water, we are swimming in it. And all of these amazingly shocking stories we've heard about the leprosy injuries, I mean, that's what happens when you're not able to feel and not able to touch. It's not a small or incidental thing, but we just don't always either perceive or at least appreciate.
And there's no group, there's no, everybody, all humans have the same feeling. It's a funny word I can think of. With touch, and there's no one that doesn't have that.
Yeah. Yeah, again, I think it's not for nothing that when we seek to describe, especially in our current circumstances where it feels so present and obvious, either the touching or the lack of touching, where it's like, it just, you feel less human when you can't touch, and it feels more human when you can. And it's just, you know, this is, we are born into it, and it seems to be kind of just this essential component, not just of how we interact with the world, but just how we are human. There are, you know, thinking about the communication of meaning through touch. There are a couple of people who are, you know, very careful with how they interact and, you know, wearing their masks, and they don't go out much and stuff like that. But there are just a couple of them that it's kind of like we've got this deal. Like they know that, you know, I am willing to hug them and they are willing to receive it. But it's not everybody, and it's not at all times. And I want to be, you know, responsible and respectful and safe and everything else. But there are a couple of people, and it's usually because of their circumstances, and we've kind of figured it out. You know, one person, you know, comes to mind very readily, and every time this person comes to drive-through communion maybe, or is here for a variety of reasons, I go ahead and I give the hug, and it's right, you know, it is meet and right so to do every time. And I think for both of us, it maybe feels all the more right because it happens so little otherwise. But also think about, I mean, we can communicate some negative stuff too. Somebody were to put their hand on yours or on your shoulder and you pull away, you don't have to say a word, but that speaks volumes, right? All right. So tactile awareness is his next section, and you know, he tells a story within this larger context of touch, but it's a story really about the reliability of someone who shows up. That's kind of how it occurs to me. So he's telling a story about well, first he does one with his parents, and then he does one about his wife. And then there's one about, isn't this the one where his grandmother, or I'm in a different section?
His mother, Granny Brand.
Granny Brand, yeah. So basically, these are people who had developed a reputation by just sticking it out, being there with people and caring for them. And so that trust and reliability built up, and they were able to then do something, say something, have an influence that someone else might not have been able to do. So I think it's 2 or 3 stories kind of smushed together. So any of them stand out to you from this little section?
Yeah, the people that had the worms in their legs because they were wading in the water,
Right.
Oh,
and then they would drink the same water. And I guess Granny Brand, through observation, figured it out what was going on. So she was able to teach them to build these walls around their drinking water to prevent people, I guess, from walking in it and then drinking the same water. And by almost single-handedly eradicated the worm problem,
Right.
which scientists couldn't have done because the people would not have accepted what they said, but they trusted Granny Brand.
Sure. And that's what's so interesting about the story, that the knowledge was not specific to her. Other people could have figured that out, or other people could have informed them, but it only made a difference coming from her. Why?
I didn't see how the stories related to the touch
Okay.
issue.
Okay. I think it's slightly more indirect, but I think I've got a little something. But so why? And it's related to this. So why Granny Brand instead of someone else? If the information was kind of like, theoretically anyone could have said it and it'd be right.
Well, she had treated them.
Well-
she had drained the pus and excised
Right.
the worms from their legs. So she had actually been hands-on treating them. And then when she figured out what was causing it, they were more likely to believe her and
Yeah.
follow.
Yeah,
They had trust. didn't they?
that's it. They trusted her because of her daily interaction with them.
Right. And that's where I think the connection is going to be. She had this daily interaction with, now when this, he gives kind of an offhanded, very vague sense of timing to this. He just says, my widowed mother turned 85. So she had been doing this for decades. She had been there serving these folks for countless years. She had shown up in their lives and she had not bailed out when she could have, or others might have. And so here's where we're in this, like in the omnipresence of touch in our lives. She was physically there with them. Now, ostensibly touching them, yes, but it's maybe a little more abstract or a little more poetic with the sense of touch. In the
Yeah.
matter of, I
Yeah,
am
it's-
there physically with you day after day, year after year, decade after
Right. Yeah, it's not a physical touch. It's just being involved with them
right. But I think it would be
consistently.
the physicality of her actual presence. Like this wasn't, you
Yeah.
know, someone that they were
Mhm.
communicating with via Zoom for decades. As helpful as this technology has been, she was actually physically present with them time and time and time again. And that kind of credibility just can't be purchased with a PhD. You know?
And there is a difference in the Zoom and the physical presence. We see that ourselves
Yeah.
in
I
our
believe it.
everyday living today.
I absolutely believe that. Here is an unnecessary digression, with one of my unpopular opinions, but it sort of feels apt somehow to me. And I'm not trying to, criticize others for my own benefit, but bear with me for a second. For all sorts of reasons, I dislike the concept of celebrity. I think it's probably poisonous for humanity. Famous, to just be famous. I don't think we're built for it. And I think, maybe you can handle it and maybe you can't, but it's never like really good for you. I truly worry, and I maybe even hate the concept of the celebrity pastor. Because this is why. The guy on TV is not your pastor. Sorry. He may be wonderful. He may be an excellent speaker. He may be deeply faithful and a wonderful Christian leader. He is not your pastor, because a pastor has to be there. If pastor comes from shepherd in the fields, you cannot shepherd from a distance people you have never met. That's not to say you cannot benefit from someone's teaching or preaching, or there can be a great sense of encouragement or all sorts of good things. But that person then would be a speaker or a preacher or an example we can learn from or benefit from or something like that, but not a pastor. And if that concept is of significance to someone, then it needs to be applied rightly in this sense, I think, because a pastor has to be there. A shepherd has to be there with the sheep, cannot, check in remotely. Shepherding was considered sort of a lower form of work because it was out in the fields and it was dirty and you smelled like sheep all the time and the hours weren't great and you were constantly exposed to the weather and the heat and everything else. But that's kind of the job. So I say that as kind of a caution and critique, but it's also to say that's part of what's really pretty crummy about trying to do things through stuff like Zoom and Facebook. I'm honestly glad we've got some of the technology now that we didn't even have 5 or 6 years ago. When this pandemic happened in 2010 maybe, we couldn't do any of this. So we've tried really hard to foster as many connections as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something essential missing that we're just trying to do without for the meantime. It's like the best of a bunch of bad options. And that's okay. Sometimes you got to make do with what you got.
That's right.
But
That's right.
there's absolutely something lost, something
The
not
intimacy.
valuable. Pardon?
Intimacy is not there.
Yeah, right. And just the real connection that can kind of only happen face to face. Now, this at least is live and we can kind of look at each other and interact live as though, it's as close as we can manage right now. But even this has a distance to it, and the inability to touch this doesn't actually make contact with you. And it can't, no matter how hard we try. And there is something legitimately precious, if not essential, that's lost in that.
Yes.
We see that with Daughters of Cain. We text, we keep prayer lists.
Yeah.
We communicate with each other. We talk on the phone.
Right. This is about Daughters of the King being able to talk and text and communicate with each other, but
we can't get together and meet, and it just feels so lost.
yeah, when you can't actually get together and meet, it just feels lost.
Disjointed.
Yes. Yeah. And artificial.
Mhm.
There's, there's something, even if you can't really define it, but it seems necessary, critical, and it's missing. And so the story from Granny Brain then kind of flows into one with his wife, and his wife treating and, you know, seeing there was a nutritional deficiency that was causing a lot of childhood blindness. They figured out a way that, you know, kind of a pretty straightforward way, a way that was already available, that they could supplement these children so this blindness could be taken care of. But even that, it had to be founded on trust. There was no amount of leaflets that could be passed around that would make as much of a difference as being told by this lady who has held your child in her arms year after year, who said, please add this and this to your diet. And it's going to make a world of difference.
Mhm.
All right, so like every other chapter, and this one felt a little short to me, I guess. I
Well,
don't know
it's
if it
very
felt that
short.
way to anybody else. It felt maybe a page or two shorter, but we finish off with this story. Anyone want to take a stab at pronouncing this last name?
Wow.
No.
Al?
No, I would guess that he is.
Al?
We're assuming it's a silent P and not Pafal, but okay. So, and so we get this story about visiting Dr. Fowl, not just a doctor, but also
A nun.
a nun. And that seems to be an essential part of this story. Before we get into her life's work in medical ministry, do you remember anything about how she got to where she was?
Mm.
That in and of itself was a story.
Convert after learning about forgiveness from a Dutch Christian who had survived Nazi concentration camps.
Right.
Sounds like Corey Ten Boom.
Yeah, I mean, that it might have been. But she basically escaped both the Nazis and the Soviets, kind of there at the end of the war. And she was deeply influenced by a Dutch Christian who had survived concentration camps. And if it wasn't Corey Ten Boom, then it sounds like somebody who has a very similar story, who could have such a powerfully, deeply personal experience of forgiveness. It's even hard to consider. And so
I think the most startling example of that strange ability to forgive that I can remember reading, and I don't remember the individual's name. He was a Olympic runner, a champion, and in the service he was captured by the Japanese.
oh, yeah. I saw that movie.
And I read the book and submitted to such humiliation. And yet he was able to forgive the ruler, the leader of that prison camp for his mistreatment.
Yes.
And yet that individual could not accept his forgiveness. Never
Right.
did.
Right.
Amazing story.
You know, there are, I won't call them common, because every time we read them, they stand out so profound and so powerful, but these stories do occur. There was one just a few years ago about, and it made the rounds, I think, on social media. I believe it was a mother who lost her daughter to, I think he was a drunk driver maybe, or something like that. And she
In
embraced
Italy.
him in court.
Mm.
And it changed this kid's life. And this is the power of forgiveness that it's basically indescribable. Not everyone has a testimony that seems so remarkable or like an example to be pondered throughout the ages. But, basically all of us should have a moment where we could consider the graciousness of God gives us something that we could not do on our own, and for no reason other than love. Whether the bridge that has been gapped feels impossibly large or it feels relatively more modest, that is understanding of grace, forgiveness that comes when there's nothing we can do about it. And so, I mean, I have to assume that certainly her conversion has something to do with her becoming a nun, but I would have to assume that it also has something to do with her being a doctor. And she chooses this life of medicine. And where is she sent?
India,
She's sent to India, but there's a problem.
Pakistan.
Yeah, she can't get in. And so she's like, well, I made it as far as Pakistan, so let me see what's around here. And what does she find?
A dump.
Yeah. She finds, what's probably an unbelievably awful circumstance, not just a dump, but I think of like the worst kind of garbage, refuge, sludge, and slime. And so overwhelming that have you ever been around something that it smells so bad you can almost feel it? As though the air were somehow thick and oily. And so in this horrible, horrible place, what else does she notice other than the garbage?
But living in it.
People. And these were lepers who had been kicked out of their homes because of their leprosy. And they were most likely picking through the garbage to live. They were setting up little shelters for themselves there because it was the only place they could find. And so what does she do?
She starts clinics for them and places for them to live all over.
And
She ministered to them.
she ministered to them she moves to the garbage dump. Now, her little wooden shack is immaculate, and all of her records are meticulous, and it's like the polar opposite of everything else that's surrounding her. But she doesn't even kind of come in on a regular basis. She lives there.
Yeah.
She works there every single day to care for these people. Pakistan's Mother Teresa, having eventually established 157 leprosy clinics across Pakistan. And so this is maybe where the touch comes full circle. It's something that we kind of depend on and we don't even think about. Without it, there's all these other problems. But we need it, we thrive on it, and we trust it in a way that we trust nothing else. Like, we trust what we can touch even more than what we can see. And she not only offers them this medical care, but she does it right there with them. And it's day after day. And he says, this is exhibiting the properties of the skin of the body of Christ, sensitivity to needs, and the steady, fearless application of divine love through human touch. Her willingness to be there day after day in that garbage. And that's what made all the difference, to physically be present with them. What's the thing about 90% of life is about showing up? I have regularly and routinely seen how much it means to others and even for myself, the difference in just showing up. Will you be there? And that, not an abstraction and not from a distance, but just showing up close enough to touch. And maybe that makes all the difference in who we actually count on and can depend on. Anything else? All right, well, we're going to start talking about bone next week. We will, we'll go ahead and we'll keep up for the next couple, 3 Wednesdays. We'll take a Christmas break, but probably not until, fairly close to Christmas. I guess maybe that week
Yeah, that'd be fine.
but we'll do, we're on December 2nd today. So I'm assuming at least 2 more classes based off of how everything else works out. And then we'll probably take a couple of weeks off, maybe between Christmas and New Year's. And then we'll keep on keeping on. All right.
Okay,
Very good.
fine.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate
luck.
it. Good to see you again.
Enjoyed it.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.